In a world gone mad, what do you teach the kids and how do you do it? Tommy Schultz is here to discuss. I'm James Poulos. This is Zero Hour. Tommy Schultz is the CEO of the AFC, that's the American Federation for Children. That's the largest school choice advocacy group in the nation. You can check them out at federationforchildren.org. Welcome, Tommy.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Okay, so children, they're good. we got to help them out. These are insane times. And real gut check, what do you teach a kid in 2024? What do they need over the course of their young lives in order to be ready to face the music?
Yeah, and gosh, we're doing a pretty bad job at it.
Terrible. And they're mad about it. They don't like it.
They're furious. Parents are furious.
Yeah.
The last 4 years in particular, after the onset of COVID and the reaction to COVID by the people who control our education system, really opened a lot of eyes, and it devastated the test scores too. I mean, you look at the nation's report card, and some of our stats are as low as they were in the 1970s, which is meaning trillions of dollars since then have been just flushed down the drain in terms of student achievement. And things are thankfully looking a little better because of school choice policies, which we can dive into, of course. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, you just look at standardized testing and all that moment when so many colleges were like, we're just going to take a pass on the SAT this time around. And there were some ideological reasons for that.
Right.
But there was this hope that, we can't, if this test if these scores are going to be this bad because so many kids have just had basically, several key formative years wiped out by remote school, Zoom school and lockdowns and all that. But now you see them coming back. And it's sort of like, no, actually, we do need to have systems in place that can actually assess whether or not a student has been properly educated. But you look at the SAT or even the ACT, and then working your way back from there down through high school and even before that, how do you even measure the kinds of robust education that are gonna make a difference in a child's life today?
Yeah, it's almost as if, imagine if you go to your doctor's office and they're like, we're not going to check your blood pressure. We're not going to check any of these vital signs. Let alone, at the higher ed level, as you're talking about, if you're an institution that has a limited school capacity and supply, like what exactly are you evaluating the students on? How well they write their essays, or how well ChatGPT writes the essays for them? The pendulum is thankfully, I think, swinging back in a lot of ways there. But when we're talking about the higher ed standardized testing that we should be doing, it should be mostly about informing parents and teachers about the progress of a student. And it shouldn't just be once a year, right? There's a lot of schools that utilize different types of testing regimes that allow teachers pretty regular assessments, even some that can be weekly or monthly, that says, oh, the student's getting off track here. We need to then get them into a better path so that they're reading and learning faster, versus the kind of typical regime state by state in the garden variety government-run public school might often be once or twice a year, and then it's like, oh yeah, here your kid didn't learn anything. Best of luck in the next grade. What a bad system, right? You'd rather have something that's fast, responsive, and there's now new AI and tech tools that are allowing kind of new entrepreneurs and new schools that have been built in the last couple of years to actually provide that almost instantaneous assessment that says, hey, he's getting a little off track on the math pathway. And lo and behold, some of these kids are able to do math or reading at 2 to 3 times the pace of even some of our best schools by just kind of pairing up technology and frankly common sense when it comes to a testing regime. So yeah, thankfully, again, the horizon is looking bright, especially as we're starting this kind of new revolution when it comes to education freedom.
Yeah, okay, so you guys cover K through 12. That's a lot of territory.
Correct.
Obviously, every one of those years is important, and if you go off the rails, you can get back on, but ideally you don't go off the rails. But from your standpoint, and from the standpoint of education freedom, what is the most critical phase in that process? Where do you really need to get the right kind of results in order to ensure that a kid sort of moves in the right direction for the rest of their life?
Sure, and this is there's been some pretty good academic research about this, like let's call it on just on one main marker around, third grade reading. If a kid isn't able to reading and able to read proficiently by third, fourth grade, almost like a 90% chance they don't get back on track. But then, as we're talking about a broader range of issues, there's really a case to be made that middle school is kind of deeply important, because if you're able to thrive in middle school, if you're able to have a student that if they were off track, they're getting back on track within a couple of years, that's going to help propel them with momentum through high school. But then you have to marry that with kind of the nature of our education system being so monolithic, one size fits all, and we could talk about all the ways we're trying to fix that and revolutionize that. But when you look at the studies of student interest and satisfaction or eagerness to learn, I mean, basically it kind of starts up, kindergarten through third grade, it goes up every single year through high school, drops down, and then maybe the last couple of years ticks back up because they're like, the end is in sight, so. But it's kind of the nature of our system is such that students aren't eager to learn, right? It's programmed, it's monotonous, it is moving them through the grade levels. There have been some small reforms on the margins to that kind of traditional public school system to maybe tackle some of these issues, but by and large, the system cannot be reformed, right? Because you're pumping $850 billion every year in taxpayer funding into the system, regardless of performance, regardless of reforms. And even you can almost see the first kind of wave of edtech that came out from the 2000s and into 2015, let's say. So much of that business model was, we want to put these great innovations into the classroom, right? Novel idea. And then they all realized the business model had to be, get the public school districts to adopt this technology, because they're going to be incentivized to take up the innovations that will then apply to the classroom learning. And then I think all the venture capitalists and a lot of folks that put a lot of money into this realize, oh, that system actually doesn't care about innovation, right? They're still getting the money. They're still getting the public funds. And so now there's a bright horizon to where we're actually going to be able to improve from day one of a kid entering into, let's call it, whether it's in kindergarten at 5 or 6 years old, even probably younger than that, where innovations and new entrepreneurship is starting to happen because all of these school choice policies that we're passing lets parents control their child's education funding. So now a new marketplace is opening up, right? So that's all the exciting stuff that's about to start happening, where I think you're going to see kids get through a primary and secondary education much faster. Parents will be more satisfied. There's probably going to be even more local schooling where neighborhoods are able to kind of organize micro schools and things like that. So yeah, the old system that we put on autopilot since the roughly 1850s and 60s, we're now finally starting to change it after 170 plus years. Yeah,
long overdue. And, I want to get into the micro schools and all that stuff in a little bit. But even just before we get there, you described the system as monolithic. It really is. It creates this paradox where, if you're aiming a fire hose of funds on something that sucks, it's not going to make it better. It's just going to make it bigger, and it's going to make it suck more. And I think people have seen that and experienced that. And in some ways, the whole COVID era was really just like a tipping point for that realization. It exposed what was going on under the surface for a lot of people. Suddenly you got your kid, and I went through this as a parent, as many did. There's that moment where you're sitting there, your kid's at home, and they're on the Zoom, and you're actually getting like a portal into the classroom, and it's not functioning the way any classroom should. So, that was not just the result of lockdowns or of that kind of weird ideological wave that swept in. This is, a lot of bills are coming due at the same time educationally. And I think one of the most monolithic things about this monolithic system is that you want kids to be on track and you want them to stay on track. But it's like, what's the track, And if it's just keep them on track for the sake of the track, not for the sake of the kid, that's a big problem. Right. I mean, when we're talking about everything from remote learning to the COVID reaction, it was a political stunt that, as you said, kind of revealed to a lot of parents what's been going on in our schools for decades, generations, ever since really the big advent of the Department of Education at the federal level in 1979. And that kind of stunt was all because the teachers' unions wanted to keep kids out of school as long as possible to create this kind of political hostage crisis such that, lo and behold, Congress gives public education $190 billion for COVID relief and reopening, which to this day, I mean, we've seen abysmal test scores. They close schools for, in some pockets, up to 2 years. Whereas in the market system, even places where Gavin Newsom sent his own kids, the private schooling system was about 90% of private schools were open by fall of 2020, right? Because they understood that
they looked at the research and mitigated the risk, and they knew that, well, gosh, we're not just getting money from the government to stay open. I mean, parents could freely choose to leave if they wanted to. We need to provide education. And so all of the parents in the private schools, and then in seeing kind of that juxtaposed next to the public school reactions, particularly in blue states, particularly in blue cities, they realize that there's something wrong here and we need to fix this. And that's why you've seen over the last 2-3 years this proliferation of education freedom, where 12 states basically have said every student is eligible now for education choice funding. On average, that's about $8,000 per kid per year that parents can control. And this is now, if you look at the long-term research on Florida, which is kind of the most, let's call it free marketplace for education, where you have not only, great and rich public schools, but you have public school choice options like charter schools, magnet schools. You also have one of the largest marketplaces where students get state funding to go to private schools. The research from David Figlio at Northwestern shows basically the places in Florida that have the most competition, the public schools get the best academic outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so now you're going to start to see kids get back on track into the future. I think in all these states that finally said, look, enough is enough. We're not doing the one-size-fits-none government system. Yeah. We want to empower parents with the freedom to choose. You're going to now start to see this wave of entrepreneurship, great school models emerge. And I think even the private schools that are brick and mortar that look a little more traditional, I think they're going to start to innovate. And then the public schools are going to get better, as we've seen in Florida, Arizona, and all these other places that have the most choice basically available. The kids are doing better. The research shows that, especially for lower income kids who oftentimes in plenty of places are just saddled with some of the worst schooling systems in the country just because of the last 5 digits that are attached to like their home address, right? Right. So the system is finally starting to be reformed and revolutionized.
Yeah, I mean, Florida's obviously doing great work in this area, and so much of just beginning to get where we need to go is a matter of just breaking up that logjam, that ossification in the marketplace, or what was substituted in for a real marketplace. But it's possible they'll try to plandemic us again. But either way, we are kind of on the other side of that lockdown era now. And yet, the kind of wokeification of education is something that is still very much with us, and in some ways just full speed ahead and continuing to increase. That's on a lot of parents' minds for obvious reasons. Right. There is, of the spicier memes that have been making the rounds lately, one of the most surprising and interesting to me coming out of the right is the idea that the woke is more correct than the mainstream. And the idea here is like, yes, the responses are wrong, but the motivation is actually correct. That the mainstream, the established way of doing things, is fundamentally broken. It is missing a proper understanding of what people need in order to function today. And the woke effort to fix that is leading to bizarre and perverse outcomes, but the intuition is more right than sometimes it gets credit for. So like an example of how that would cash out is you have this legacy education system, and you have this like serve the track and the student's almost an afterthought. And it's just kind of an assembly line model. There isn't a lot of innovation. There isn't a lot of experimentation. Yep. There's an assumption that we'll spit them out after K through 12, and they're really gonna test well. We're gonna teach to the test. They're gonna go to the best college they can get into. They'll get taught to the test there too. They'll be turned into knowledge workers who know how to research and know how to take instruction. They'll be very compliant. They'll go whether they're sort of at the middle management level or the human resources level or even maybe the iBanker level or the consultant level. They'll just be like good cubicle people, and this is going to unlock prosperity. Everyone's going to become a knowledge worker, and we'll all live happily ever after. And in fact, like that story, however well-intentioned or however much it made sense, trying to figure out the future, bridge to the 21st century in sort of the Clinton, second-term Clinton 90s, that story turned out to be completely wrong. We see that we overproduce these kind of overeducated knowledge workers who have these BS jobs, and it actually isn't so good for economic growth, and it actually creates this kind of bubble, and when the bubble pops and the music stops, everyone's worse off. You have all these millennials, they have all the degrees, they did everything right, and where are they? Well, they're at Starbucks. And the thing that makes them feel like they have some hope for the future is they have like 800 of these kind of identitarian pins. They're allowed to like brandish their identity and be loved in the workplace, and they kind of have to settle for that. And so the woke response to that is like, no. Like, actually, we're turning people into drones, and we've created this structure for them that doesn't actually respect the whole person and doesn't understand the value of lived experience. So we have to create this like spiritual framework, and we need social and emotional learning. Yeah. We need to inculcate them into a worldview. We need to sort of like engage in spiritual formation. And well, they took that ball and they ran with it. And what happened? Well, it's working. It is responsive. Yeah. And yes, it's terrible and perverse and, it creates all these kinds of bad outcomes, but the intuition was basically correct, that the legacy system was really ossified, really bureaucratic, and really sort of one size fits all, and didn't serve the whole person and set kids up for a certain kind of failure. That seems to be correct. And so there's now this opening, and you see it in Florida, where people who are anti-woke but also anti the legacy system are finding ways of creating the space where students can receive that kind of deeper spiritual and cultural formation.
Right.
So yay for Florida, obviously good. How do you reorient the rest of the country and the rest of student bodies across America in that kind of direction?
Right. Yeah, so lots to unpack there, but I think what you were kind of pointing to in regards to like the way the system is designed and what the outcomes it's producing goes again back to like how we designed it in the first place, which was kind of trying to adopt this Prussian model of education.
Right.
Kind of in the pre-war era, it was the blueprint for this, and then when the 1917 on era, through the 50s up till the Sputnik moment, essentially, that blueprint really kind of got on steroids because it said, look, we need the orderly factory workers. We need the orderly soldiers. We have a huge industrial revolution that's upon us that has wartime means, right? That suddenly demands that we put these kids into that system. Then, then there's huge infusions of cash, more kind of bureaucratic kind of dynamics added in the 60s, 70s, 80s that then led us to this point that you're talking about, which is we really pushed this kind of notion of education that was far different than the really high quality education that a lot of students were able to access in the years like at the beginning of our kind of time where we were teaching more of a classical model of education, right? And the memes that you talk about that are floating around the internet, when you just look at like what were the average ages of the American founders, right? When they're like all 20 years old,
right.
And the text you're reading, it's like, oh my gosh. Or you look at even like some of the Harvard applications that were from like the 40s and 50s to get into Harvard. And so it's like, it's staggering. You couldn't even, no high school student would be able to even touch much of the learning that those kids were required of in generations prior.
No, and you were expected to know a thing or two about, theology. I mean,
right.
The aperture was so much wider.
Right. And, to your point about what that then led open, which was this kind of notion that a value system could be still introduced into this supposedly valueless education system, right? And while we were kind of declawing, there's a number of Supreme Court rulings that kind of declawed the ability for prayer in schools, you name it, within the public schooling system. And even if you look at the late 1890s, there was this interesting push that we could go down a rabbit hole on it called Blaine Amendments, where James G. Blaine was trying to essentially, it was this kind of anti-Catholic push that was trying to make sure that no public funds were going to private schools, because at that time, the private schools were largely Catholic schools, whereas the public schools were more of a Protestant schooling system. But then, over the next 100 years, when you kind of remove any kind of religious aspect of schools, suddenly it becomes this new version that is, it's still a system that's inculcating values within our students. And, every controversy from what do we do with sex education, right? In the 60s, 70s, these debates really start raging. And then to today's version, which is, we're teaching kind of a pseudo-Marxist kind of version of history and anything from every subject, even math supposedly, you start to realize like, this system actually, we thought we were making sure that a religious set of doctrines weren't being imposed upon our students. It's like, well, it's religious without a name, right? Yeah. And now we're giving it a name, and now parents are actually realizing, gosh, they are teaching values that I disagree with. What do I do? And this gets to your point about Florida. The natural knee-jerk instinct, I think, for most kind of let's call it neophyte observers of the system is, well, let's go to the school board, let's change the school board. Well, again, a lot of people tried this in the 90s or even early 2000s, like, let's change the school boards. And then they all realized, and most of them, if you really talk to the experts that have either funded this effort or have tried to reform the schools from the school board level, they realize, yeah, you can maybe make some marginal progress on the budgets here and there for a couple of years, but then the teachers unions and the other folks just wipe you out 2 or 3 years later in the elections. Yeah. And then, so what we started doing and what the founders of our movement started doing in the early 90s with the, first starting the Milwaukee school voucher program, charter schools, they realized if you make state laws that suddenly start to give families full control of their child's education pathway, that's the best way to reform the system. Because you can give out scholarships endlessly, right? But you will run out of private capital eventually and the system won't be reformed. Again, you can try to make reforms within the system. There's plenty of huge historic efforts that have been thrown at this. I mean, the federal government's multi-billion-dollar school improvement grant system, which a couple of years after the Obama administration gets out, like the federal government's own reports was like, yeah, that was basically a waste of money. Bill Gates and others tried to do small class size interventions and all these other sorts of interventions within the public school system that they all, Gates wrote in his own annual letters saying like, yeah, it was a big swing and a miss and we're not seeing the results for the $8 billion we pumped into this. But then, again, places like Florida, Arizona, Ohio, Indiana, you name it, they really pushed the gas on saying, why don't we kind of redefine public education such that we're not just raising taxpayer monies and just dumping it into the one-size-fits-none system. Why don't we raise private and public capital, let parents control it, and then suddenly a marketplace can emerge. And then you even saw the public system in Florida build out kind of this notion that like, hey, every single kid, regardless of what school they're in, public, homeschool, private, you name it, they are part of the system and we want the whole system to succeed. That then enables the last few years when parents get really angry about culture war issues in the schools or you name it, what the values are being taught or even secret policies that they're hiding from the parents and not telling them about, which is just horribly personal stuff. Yeah. That again, the school districts are either saying we won't we won't tell the parents, this is private. Suddenly those parents now have a safety valve to say, sorry, we're out, we're opting out, we're taking our money elsewhere. That's the only way you're going to reform this, because otherwise it's good that we are making systematic laws and changes to public schools, but this system is just inherently so large, so dug in, has so much money, they can resist all sorts of reforms. And teachers in a lot of ways, a lot of people don't really recognize this, but teachers in a lot of ways get to be free operators within the system, right? Like we don't have like a nationalized set of curriculum where some other countries do this kind of notion of,
very Prussian.
Yeah, right, where almost like they can say like, I forget who, if it's like a Swedish education secretary or something said like, I can look at my watch and I know what's being taught in every classroom at this exact moment. We don't really have that system. And therefore, that's where a lot of this bad stuff can start to happen when a teacher can just say, I'm going to ignore, even the laws that Florida's put down. Thankfully, they're kind of making some reforms of this, but that's where you can just see, gosh, this system cannot be reformed. We have to build a new system that gives parents the ability to vote with their feet, right? Yeah. And then they can choose, this is the better path for my sons and daughters. Each kid is unique. They can go to different options. So that is the way that if you're furious with the way that a school is inculcating values into your kids in a way that like you disagree with violently, if you're in a state like, let's call it Baltimore, Maryland, where it's just like, hey, sorry, you're going to this public school, tough luck. You're stuck, right? Yeah. Otherwise, Florida, all these other places, you can choose, you can move.
Well, just the teachers, like we've seen the social media videos, and sometimes it's teachers themselves saying like, yes, correct, I consider my job, my real job, to be queering your children. This is how we win. It's all out in the open now, and in some ways that's pretty frightening, but in other ways it's very clarifying. It's very plain now in a way that it wasn't, I think, even just 5 years ago. Sort of what the stakes are, what the options are, and how dramatically they diverge. I gave maybe a tiny olive branch to the wokies a couple of minutes ago. Now I'm going to hit them with a bigger stick. One of the very worst of their intuitions, of their sort of like gut sense about how it is that we got to this. It was starting in the 90s, so much optimism, like we got this, we're just going to run this playbook, it's going to be great. Why did it break down? One of their intuitions is, well, it broke down because the family sucks. The family is bad. It doesn't give people the spiritual formation that they need. We need to break the bonds of the family, escape the family. We can't really be free. We can't really be who we are unless we renounce the family. And they've taken that idea and they've run with it, and now we're starting to see the fruits that as well. Not very Prussian, but strangely, they are becoming more regimented.
Sure.
More that kind of classic or 19th century progressive idea, and marrying that kind of militant, routinized approach to what many people think of as gender chaos or whatever. Well, it's not that chaotic anymore. It's being regimented into this kind of theocratic system.
Yeah.
I'm curious to talk a little bit more, if you can, about what is going on at the state level in Arizona.
Sure.
What's interesting to me, being a Californian who spends a lot of time in Texas, kind of going back and forth, is here's a state in Arizona which is a little bit, off the radar relative to California and to Texas. California, kind of the bastion of sort of, the left in 2024. Texas becoming kind of the capital of red state America or whatever. And obviously different models. But then, you got Florida over there, and Florida's doing cool stuff, but it really is almost this island that's just sort of sticking out into, into its own world. And it's not clear kind of where the wildfire of that combines sort of free marketism with really just kind of pluralism, where it's like, hey, people in 2024 are going to disagree about the kind of spiritual formation they want their children to have. And one of the good things about the freedom and innovation that you see in Florida is not just that it increases competition, and competition is good, it makes people better, whatever, but that it's appropriate for people to find their path and to find a way for their children to be formed in the way that they think is best. At a certain level, you got to allow families to do that, even if you look at what they're doing to their kids and go like, I don't know, seems crazy to me. At a certain level, if you want families to be strong, you got to let them find their path.
Right.
So there is kind of this question of like, well, where's that going to spread to first? What's going to become the bastion in sort of mainland America? No offense to Florida, we know the Panhandle exists, but where's it going to be? And Arizona seems to be out to kind of maybe an early lead in that respect.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of action in the Sun Belt going on right now, especially coming out of COVID. A lot of Californians looking for places to go. They're not all going to come to Texas, and Texas doesn't want all of them to come to Texas. So what's the story with Arizona? What's going on there? I think it's a very interesting case study and a sort of maybe a model of what a state that's a little bit one step removed from kind of the political hot seat that Florida and Texas are in.
Sure. Arizona certainly is its own political hot seat in a lot of other ways, but we'll talk about kind of the how they've always been at the forefront of a lot of education reforms, particularly on the education freedom and school choice dynamics. And I mean, really for 20 plus years, Arizona has stepped on the gas saying, we want to provide more and kind of the newest phase of options available to families. So they went in on charter schools. They pushed for a kind of scholarship program early on. And then in 2011, they were the first state to really put forward a concept called education savings accounts, which is what now is kind of the new dominant type of mechanism for giving families education freedom that is all across the state, all across the country. And now Arizona was the first one to bring it really to every single family at the end of Doug Ducey's term in 2022. So basically what it means is Arizona said every family is now eligible for an education savings account. The account is controlled by the parent. The government deposits about $8,000 per kid per year into that account, and they can spend that money on a host of approved education expenses. Everything from a simple, one-time transaction with private schools for tuition, or you can really customize it, homeschooling, special needs therapies, tutoring, textbooks, laptops for kind of education and whatnot. That the state has said, we want parents to really customize and embrace this notion that, in the land of Goldwater of Arizona, right, that we believe and trust in parents to make the right decisions for their kids versus just saying, raise taxpayer money, give it to the school districts, and let them figure it out, right?
Yeah.
And so Arizona has just always been on the leading edge of this. And I think what's going to be exciting, the innovations we're seeing in Arizona already, is that there's some charter school networks that charter schools are public schools, and they are operated and managed by an independent body, so not the government, but they still fall under a lot of government restrictions and regulations. There's charter school networks now in Arizona that have announced we're actually going to start opening up private schools because of the new program that got expanded. And so I think there's that aspect of how the public schools and charter schools are even starting to say, well, let's make some changes within our system or our business model. And then secondly, there's now a whole new wave of kind of entrepreneurs that we've seen in Florida, but Arizona is now, I think, going to turbocharge that as well, where former public school teachers who Did you know that the average like lifespan of a public school teacher is about 3-4 years? Because why is that, right? The system is an eager teacher comes out of saddling themselves up with debt by taking on the kind of higher education degrees that are required of them. They get into the classroom. They realize this system is, crazy. There's not a lot of support. Yeah. There's a lot of bureaucrats. There's a lot of rules, paperwork. And then 3 years in, they're like, well, the only way to make more money is to go into administration and leave the classroom, or I could stick it out. So then, the average like NFL player is only in the NFL for 3 years.
Yeah, they hit the wall really fast.
So now think of the human capital that's been sidelined all across the country. There's probably tens of millions of former teachers who are like, I'd love to be back in the classroom. And now if they're looking at Arizona going, wait a minute, I can get 10 to 20 kids within a classroom, utilize kind of a good entrepreneurial out-of-the-box schooling kind of system that says, here's how you can start up a school, here's the kind of tech platform, tech stack that can help you do this, recruit some families. Suddenly you can be making 6 figures in revenue as a teacher. Yeah. And even in a lot of ways, you can build an untraditional looking type of school in Arizona where maybe you're only doing 2 hours of like a bolus dose of real academics that, again, you can learn just as much than, or faster than an average public school student. And then you're doing real, robotics, STEM, engineering, financial kind of literacy, all sorts of things that are applicable to real life skills that gets you out of that rut like you were talking about earlier of just put them into the knowledge economy that is, saddling them with too much over-education but not enough learning, right? And so that's where it's like Arizona and Florida, by opening the doors for new entrepreneurs to emerge within the laws that they kind of built that says you can take students using the education savings accounts. You can build in a full-time schooling system, a hybrid schooling system that's part-time, remote, part-time in person. You're now really building out a marketplace that is customizing to the needs of families. And we talked earlier about the first version of kind of edtech and how people lost their shirts or just didn't see it as a viable option. Now I know there's going to be a lot of venture capitalists, a lot of folks going, wait a minute, we can actually innovate in a new system. That's where Arizona and Florida really took the lead in the last couple of years by saying, they want to build this, wide open marketplace that allows families to kind of fully choose regardless of income, regardless of, status or background, versus most other places in America. You probably dealt with this in California, or you see it in New York, where, other parents will ask you, oh, where are you sending your kids to school? You'll hear somebody say, oh, we moved to this better school district, right? And it's like, gosh, that's so great. Or then it's like, oh, we're putting our kids into this private school. Oh, that's amazing. You a great legacy. Love that school. But then think about, it's like, well, if you don't have the financial means or ability to move, it's just like, well, you're stuck. And then in those blue states, quite often, if those lower income, mostly minority families are saying, we would like a charter school, or I would like an education savings account, then the teachers union goes to war against them. We have this opt-out system that we praise, and it's just fundamentally wrong, whereas Arizona, they're doing it right.
Yeah, this is really, it's almost a secret weapon, I think, because you look at the college level, and folks on the right for generations have felt themselves to be in a position where it's like, well, they might hate me, and they might want to turn my kid into someone who hates me, but gosh darn it, they're still just better at education.
Got to get that, credential
diploma. They're gonna train my kid to get a job that is going to work well for them.
Yeah.
And they send the kid and they cross their fingers and hope for the best. That isn't the way that it's been at the K through 12 level. Not at all. Quite the contrary. And so what I'm seeing is a situation unfolding where the force of innovation and just like creating some optionality that is reflective of the reality of raising and training kids at that age is flourishing to the right of center, and it's just nowhere to be found on the left. Yeah, you've got like social educational learning or whatever, and this is innovative or whatever. Kind of, but it also isn't actually preparing kids in the way that they need to be prepared. And the reality of the situation is like, there are those woke teachers who jump on TikTok and talk about how they're going to queer your kids and there's nothing you can do about it. That is a vanguard that I think a lot of sort of like generically left teachers have felt they have really no choice but to line up behind at the K through 12 level. Well, they're kind of, we're kind of stuck with them, and I guess I sympathize, and I don't want to rock the boat, and I don't want to get fired, and I don't want the teachers union to hate me, so I'm just going to go along. But if there's this vibrant ecosystem that's coming out of states that are coded red or whatever, these are actually places where if you're a generic lefty, and a lot of these people actually do care about education, and they actually do want to spend all their time around other people's children, which a lot of folks on the right, for whatever reason, they don't want that. They don't want to have to deal with wrangling these people, especially if they don't speak English or whatever. It seems like that's not what they want to do. They're not into it. And a lot of the folks who are into that and are willing to just kind of eat that responsibility every day, they do tend to lean to the left. And if you can create an environment for them where you say, like, look, we're coming from a different place, maybe ideologically, but if the proof of that is, this is a place where you can actually teach, where the system is not dysfunctional, where you're not going to be led around the nose by the absolute craziest, most deranged people who are on your side or whatever, that's going to be a godsend to them, because they're not going to hit that 3-year wall and say, like, I just can't anymore. Like, I love my kids love me, teaching is so important. I'm even ideologically broadly aligned, but it just doesn't work. I'm out. If you give them the opportunity to plant those seeds, I think a lot of those people are going to take it, and I think they're going to be better off, and they're not going to indoctrinate kids as much.
Well, and you talked about a related point earlier that, in the 90s, there was kind of this, and you heard it often from the education establishment, the people running our schools, that it was always blame the parents, right? It was always the families, the problem. And you often heard that it's like, well, these kids are terrible because their parents are terrible or they're not doing anything. Well, if you're a parent that's genuinely wanting a better education for your kid, and again, you have to go yell at the school board for 2 hours on a Thursday evening, I mean, what hope of recourse do you have, right? And therefore, now in places where, the dozens and dozens of states that have opened up this education marketplace where families truly are empowered to make a choice for their kid, you're seeing in particular lower income families getting more invested in their children's education. And I think there was definitely sort of a tendency over the last 40 years, as you were talking about left versus right kind of parenting methodologies in some sense, there was a lot that was sort of like, look, let's just send them to the school, or maybe even if we choose a school that we have heard of that as having good values, there wasn't a lot of, I think, enough investment into going, what are the methodologies that they're teaching my kids? What history books are you teaching them? How do you approach these, sensitive issues in the classroom? I think too many parents were just sort of devolving that just to the oftentimes, and especially in the district schools, the faceless bureaucrats, right, that are running these things. And I'm excited that now, because of this new realm of education freedom that's been emerging, parents are actually going to be thinking more critically about each of the steps of their kids' kind of progress of like, what values are they learning, and where does my kid have a strength that I want to kind of double down on that strength, right? Yeah. Versus, again, just send them into the blob, and then the higher ed level version of that you described, which is, look, just put them into college because everybody's got to go to college, right? Because employers want that. And it's like, well, when only like 1/3 of Americans have a college degree, I mean, actually, no, most people clearly don't need to go to college. And, higher ed is a whole different self-regulating cartel, whereas K-12 is a monopoly. That's just a whole different set of dynamics. But my hope is now that there's going to be way more of a kind of a cultural shift amongst families saying, especially in these states where we've passed these policies that allow them to fully control their education funding, parents are now going to be much more critical decision makers and think more, critically, thoughtfully about each phase of their kids. If they're kindergarten, where should they go? What's that pipeline? Versus, there's a lot of those cultural aspects on the, this last generation of private schooling where it's just like, well, that's the elite school. I got to get my kid into that school, or this one's just closest to my house. We got to do that. I think now parents are going to be much more. They're going to have a lot more options to actually kind of navigate a better pathway for their kids, and then there's going to be more investment into that. Teachers are going to be more, scrutinized, and the bureaucracy is going to be scrutinized. I think that's going to be leading to a human flourishing method and model that we just have never seen before in our education system for at least a couple hundred years.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. And we bag on the progressives for good reason. I've been with the Claremont Institute for a number of years, and a solid part of Claremont doctrine is that those nasty European progressives came over from Germany, and they started setting up shop at Johns Hopkins, like other universities, and kind of turned everything into that kind of Germanic sort of Hegelian, it's progress and we can understand it, and the spirit of progress moves through history, and we got to chain our future to that, and that's how we're going to train. That's how we're going to train people, and we're going to make it feel okay to be a cog in the machine because we know that the kind of spirit of history moves through the machine. And that's all true. But even before the progressives, you had the Whigs. And if you this is going to deep lore here, but I think it's important. It was always kind of a part of Whiggish political philosophy to say, look, you can't trust the ordinary people to keep up with the pace of change.
Yeah.
And so you go back to the Whigs in America, and they were nationalists, not necessarily a bad thing, but there was this preoccupation, which is like, oh, all those people in the interior of America, if they're not in Philadelphia or New York, they're basically bumpkins, and if you leave them to their own devices, they're just going to kind of sink into the fields of the heartland and not amount to anything. They're not going to have that kind of dynamism, that kind of
cosmopolitan
sophistication, right? They're not going to have it. And what we're seeing now, I guess Florida is not really considered the heartland, but in some ways it's more the heartland than Illinois at this point, ideologically speaking.
Yeah.
You look at Florida, you look at Arizona, obviously Texas. You are starting to see that those folks who are in the nation's interior are kind of at the front lines in terms of sort of massaging things and seeing, what we can make happen, dumping the ingredients down on the table and saying, what can we put together here that's just going to see if we can get better results and results that we can kind of, A/B test. And I think that's really important, and that's really exciting. And one of the best things about that kind of laboratory of democracy aspect of federalism when it's applied to education is you can really give credit where it's due. So you can look at states like Arizona, states like Florida, and I'll convert this into a question now, is who can we identify as being the folks who really got the ball rolling in the right kind of way at the head of the line, so that now we can look back and say, well, it's been about 10 years, 15 years in the case of Arizona. And we are starting to see some results, and we can kind of start to say, like, okay, these are the folks who got it right. They're the ones who took the initiative. They made the right bets, and those bets are now paying off. Who are those folks just at the state level that you'd single out for special praise?
We could whip around kind of the last 30 years. I mean, you can go back to like Governor Tommy Thompson in Wisconsin to do the first, city level voucher program in the modern era. Then Jeb Bush in Florida in late 90s, early 2000s. Putting forward all basically options on the table for a set of public school reforms, but then most importantly, I would say the choice options, kind of getting those going in those early years. And then Arizona, I mean, really in the most recent years, Governor Doug Ducey, 2022, he passed that law in September, which gave all families eligible access to that education savings account program. Suddenly then, months later, Kim Reynolds in Iowa passes it in January of 2023. It goes like Iowa, Utah, Arkansas, Indiana, dozens of other states suddenly go like, the water is warm. We can try out these new sets of reforms, as you said, in this kind of federalism laboratory of democracy. But the places with the kind of union-heavy, control of the system, like New York City, I mean, charter schools can't even expand by a square inch in that city.
Right.
California, again, they're closing schools down for 2 years while the governor's sending his kids to private schools. All of these states in the kind of really, Sun Belt, like you said, Midwest, they have really expanded this notion of what does education mean and how do we actually have it function. And at the end of the day, it's still going to be a hard road for some of those kind of monopolistic blue style, states that, because of the influence of the teachers unions. You talked earlier about, teachers being willing to, buck the trend against the unions. I mean, how much would you guess that the teachers unions bring in revenue in any given year right now? Take a guess.
I'm scared to guess.
Well, it's about $3 billion.
Yeah, it's insane.
And when you think of that, I mean, they are dominating Democratic Party politics. They're like one of the number one, if not the number one funder of 100%. Democratic dynamics.
Oh, in California, they almost run the state in some respects.
Exactly. And so when you kind of think about how it's like, gosh, there's a structural issue there that is going to be hard. We do have plenty of Democrats that have voted for school choice legislation. We had 39 this year, I believe, that they're really sticking their necks out and they're going to be, facing a wave of spending against them in the primaries that they're that brave that they're saying, look, this is such a bad and important issue right now in my community that we desperately need options, and they're still willing to go against that $3 billion behemoth. That's where suddenly when you're talking about the Whigs and kind of the eras of American education, progressive eras, then the kind of bureaucratic eras, then the Sputnik era, like all these different things you can think about. Heck, if you want to go back to the original, like, first compulsory education law, which was like 1647, the old deluder Satan law or whatever, which is like, we need our kids in school because they need to learn the Bible and they don't want to be tempted by Satan. When you kind of go through all these eras, it's like, we are now, the next 10 years, I truly believe, is going to be a wave of innovation that we've never seen before, and frankly, led by a lot of these Midwestern, even the Sun Belt states. And again, Arizona really was the one that flicked that first domino back in 2022. That is going to be, I think, now Texas on the precipice of doing it probably next year, where just even think of what COVID did to like commercial real estate and how much empty commercial real estate there is. Heck, even the studio here, where you can imagine we could set up a micro school for the families and employees that are here. We can devise it to, a value system that we want, high quality learning as well. Or you talk about rural America and how, so many people are retreating to the suburbs and the cities, moving out of rural areas. This could be rural revitalization. Florida already has like doubled the number of rural private schools in the last 10 years because, again, great teachers or former teachers have said, I want to start a school that's in my community, that'll keep people here, has our values. And guess what? There's already a lot of empty buildings or churches and church facilities that are going unused 5 days a week that, again, you can start a small school in that community. That's where it's like all these sorts of innovations are going to start to take place that, this is a civilizationally important issue, right? It's like housing, healthcare, education are kind of three bedrock kind of major policy dynamics that we really got to tackle. And I think for too long, for those that are free market kind of in terms of their thinking or conservative in their values, really haven't really tackled education, in the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, I would say people who aren't even in a ideological camp suddenly realize in the last 3 or 4 years, like you said, wait a minute, they're teaching things that I just do not, this is not common sense stuff. This is radical ideologies. And only 30% of kids are actually proficient in reading and math. What are we doing here? We have to fix this. So that's where it's like this next era is going to be just so exciting, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's strange to feel like really moved and touched and inspired by education policy, which for so long has been sort of like, not at the vanguard of any political movement. I spend a lot of time around sort of tech issues, and just the amount of bad vibes that have emanated from like decades of promises about innovation.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to retrain workers. Oh, like iPads in the classroom. Like, oh man, like this is, it's all going to be the knowledge economy. Just like this litany of promises of a golden age that's just right around the corner. And, just do what the Chamber of Commerce says and just listen to the free marketeers. And if we just like run those algorithms, it's going to be heaven on earth.
Right.
And you know what? It wasn't.
Yeah.
And I think that really just like burned a lot of people and depressed a lot of people in the movement and made a lot of people really suspicious of that stuff. But even setting aside the failures of institutionalized libertarianism, you look at the other side, with sort of the remnant of like intellectual trads, like really traditionalists, like sort of religious like guys who are sort of hanging on in the academy on the right. They've had a tough road too. And their hopes of like, oh no, if we just, all we have to do is just keep teaching whatever it is that I have a PhD in. That's how we're going to save America. It's Tolkien, baby. And it's like, I understand why they have that point of view. But that has seemed to be really a dead end too. And, I got on my cheat sheet here, how to avoid nerd welfare. And so much of what, the kind of leftovers, the remnant of conservatives trying to do education policy who recognize that libertarianism really fell on its face in many respects. They thought tech was going to fix everything. It didn't. They thought just decentralization was going to fix everything. It's not that simple. But gosh, we have wound up with a lot of folks on the right saying like, oh, basically we need to make sure that conservative nerds can get a job in academia, and that's what's going to define our education policy. If we just teach, Plato and if we just teach the Aeneid to high schoolers, then we're going to save America. And it's just not that simple, because there are these deep-seated structural problems.
Yeah.
And to see, a place where suddenly we have this convergence where it's like, wow, you can teach the kids classical stuff, you can have Christian academies, you can give Jeb Bush an attaboy for something. Like suddenly all these threads are coming together, and coming together in a way where even those, generic lefty teachers who have been burned by this totally dysfunctional system have somewhere that they can turn, and they can maybe win too. That's really powerful. Yeah. And I think that the moment has finally gotten to a point, sometimes things really do need to get so bad that it kind of brings everything together. The solution emerges out of the miasma, and it's something that people can really get behind because it causes tangible benefits. They're not immediate, but 4 years is a long time for a student, and it can go by in a blink of an eye for a parent. And we're really hitting that kind of inflection point. And I think the work that you're doing and folks in this area, it really does matter. The rubber is really hitting the road right now. And, I just want to, congratulations for being in the right place at the right time.
Thank you. I mean, look, our kids, they're our future, right? And when you talk about things getting so bad for enough people, right, that it finally reached that tipping point in the last few years, I mean, think of the generations of kids of lower income families. I mean, this has basically been a poverty engine, our public education system. Such that finally once I think really middle class families also started to see wait a minute, I thought I moved to that better school district. I moved to the Highland Park of Texas, the nicer school district, and they realized there's actually problems in all these sorts of, every single community's got an issue with their education system. Parents started to wake up, and now the parents started to realize too, we can change this, right? We can lobby our governor about this. We can talk directly to our state legislators to say, change the state law. And guess what? We're a bigger union of parents than the teachers' unions, right? And so the teachers' unions and Randy Weingarten and all these people that have been running our education system into the ground for the last 40, 50 years, suddenly parents are like, wait a minute, I can actually, if I mobilize and if we get school choice policies in place, we can control our kids' education. Total game changer. And as I think through, again, I always, it's horrible to think through the worst parts of our society, where you talked about Illinois a second ago, where a report came out that 50 schools had 0% of students proficient in math. I mean, you talk about a crisis that has just been slow rolling and slow moving for so long. Think of what our economy could be doing. Think of what, every single aspect of our society, if we really tackle this, which is in a lot of ways, I point to Florida as the best government funded anti-poverty system because of their education system that they built. If we can actually start to turn that around, and when you have all these people that, like you said, have their notion of what education should be, that oftentimes they've been screaming into nothing and they've been on the sidelines. Now it's okay, we'll build it, see if people come, see if it flourishes, see if parents take on to this. Versus, I think I loved kind of you talking about Silicon Valley and tech, the promise of innovation. Well, if that's only just nested out of San Francisco-based companies and not really kind of thinking about, we don't want to just keep developing new apps that are new clever ways to send emojis to each other, but no, we need to build schools, which are, again, civilizationally important. Like you said, a few years is a huge opportunity to get a kid back on track versus current K through 12 system. If you want to go reform it, the old school system, right? It's usually you go to that superintendent or whatever, they're like, we've got a 10-year turnaround plan that never comes to fruition, right? And the kids are still just getting devastated. This is where it's we're at a totally new tipping point. And finally, I think all new sorts of, I think you're going to see dozens of new education models, emerge from this. You're going to see a revival of some of those classical models that, yes, involve the Aeneid, maybe some Greek and Latin in the mix, but I think you're going to start to see all sorts of new things that really meet the individual needs of a kid. Every parent knows their kid is so different in their learning and their personalities, you name it, and that we might see a revitalized workforce into the future, a revitalized economy versus this monolithic system that isn't dynamic, that's basically being run by Elizabeth Warren in a lot of ways. You're suddenly going to start to see human flourishing in a way that we've never seen before, especially in these states that embrace it. These other ones, I mean, gosh, like you said, California, juxtaposed to Arizona, a lot of families from Southern California could move right over to Arizona and get instant access to this kind of funding. Even Florida, there's a lot of these Jewish day schools that have drop-down menus on the website that say, are you moving from New York because of our school choice policies? Here's what you need to know. You're going to start to see these kind of people voting with their feet, moving out of these states, partly because of education, because it's such a deeply important part of the American life.
Yeah, it's not just the future, it's the present now.
That's right.
Tommy Schultz, go forth, get after it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, that's all we got. Until next time around, meanwhile, if you're watching on YouTube, give us that like, hit the subscribe button, smash it, comment below. Who do you want me to interview next? I want to know what you want to see. Until next time around, this is Zero Hour. I'm James Poulos. May God have mercy.